Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. We've got a lot of things to talk about. We're going to get in, obviously, to this the Supreme Court ruling. The two rulings, I imagine most people have heard about them. You'll recall the Biden administration issued a mandate via OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration agency, and that mandate was everyone must test on a weekly basis amongst your workforce unless they are vaccinated. So there was a vaccine exemption for your workforce if you had 100 more employees.
So covering it as a vaccine mandate is inaccurate because it wasn't. You could test once a week and they just have to have a mask if they're unvaccinated.
Exactly.
And this would affect 84 million people. So it's substantial. Substantial.
And it may not be obvious. Apparently, it's not obvious to the Supreme Court why the occupational safety, the agency tasked with protecting people at work, why that might be important, despite the fact that the Supreme Court, those people there are either vaccinated or testing before they walk into that room, despite the fact that there were people not in the room who were in there via Zoom because they were COVID positive, which suggests that they had a test. Despite the fact that the Supreme Court was also remote for much of the past 2 years. Somehow they didn't understand this concept that there is something unique about work in a workplace relative to just walking around outside. Well, and that is when people congregate.
That's what's nuts about it, too, is that they made a distinction between the grave danger of a workplace and new hazards. But they basically said that if the hazard also exists outside of the workplace, then then it doesn't necessarily count. So like the outside hazard negates the hazard also being inside. But for some reason, the hazard is very clear and present to healthcare workers, which they upheld. So even by their own logic, by the second ruling, it doesn't make any sense.
Well, I mean, it is more obvious that it is a heightened risk for healthcare workers because you have more people presumably coming in with COVID, theoretically, I guess. But it is the act of congregating which heightens the risk. And you could argue, like the Supreme Court did, that you have this risk associated if you go to, let's say, a basketball game. The difference is you don't need to go to a basketball game to eat. You are not compelled. You have the option to assume that higher level of risk. The whole point of OSHA is to protect workers. And if workers could willy-nilly decide that they don't want to go in and still retain the ability to eat, because remember, we've already determined as a society, and I know my right-wing friends would agree with this, that asking for vaccine mandates when you go into the movie is coercive. So if your desire to see a movie can be coerced, then certainly your need to eat, it's also coercive to say that you've got to come in, like your job is coercive.
Art fills you more than food, Sam.
Many respects, but, you know, I assume people go to see just, you know, big popcorn movies too. That aren't necessarily artistic.
Right. Well.
So the Supreme Court has created a false dichotomy. Look, I got into this with Ben Shapiro, and we should pull those tweets for later in the program. I got into this with Ben Shapiro on Twitter last night, too. He was talking about, like, the Supreme Court no longer is going to force us to fire our I can't even remember what he said. But the suggested, but he thought it was a really weird thing to require.
Fire his employees, he was basically saying, which of course he would. That's a complete.
Well, but he also said for other
mischaracterization of the reality.
Right, and for other things too. But the bottom line is that he thought it was weird that OSHA would do this. And I said, do you think it's weird when OSHA says that employees have to wash their hands after they go to the bathroom in restaurants? Now, the fact of the matter is, it is a danger to people outside of restaurants if you've got a lot of people going around and not washing their hands after they go to the bathroom. But OSHA says if you're coming into work and you're working here, you've got to wash your hands. It is a danger that exists outside. Food poisoning is a danger that exists outside of a restaurant. Passing germs exists outside of a restaurant. If you're working on scaffolding in the city, there are protections for you as a worker.
Do slips, trips, and falls only happen in the workplace?
Exactly.
Well, of course.
Exactly.
And so this is just a made-up distinction. There's nothing in the statute that suggests that it's there.
And there's nothing in the OSHA rules either. I mean, right, exactly.
There's nothing in the statute that authorizes even the existence of OSHA. There's no place in our Federal Registry of Laws where it says this stuff only applies to hazards that are unique to the workplace. And I would argue that these hazards are unique to the workplace. And how do we know this? Because we have millions upon millions upon millions of Americans who are not going to work. They are working from home. Why are they doing this? Why would they do this? They are avoiding contact with other people to the extent that they can. But if you are employed by these companies, your ability, broadly speaking, I'm sure there are some individuals who could bubble themselves off, maybe the CEO or whatnot. And presumably, you can't get tested if you're not coming into any type of a workplace. This is a mandate for testing again. It really is incredible. And understand what's going on here. This is the Supreme Court's march, and we have talked about this over and over and over again. We've talked about this for 5 or 6 years. There is something called the non-delegation principle that right-wing jurists believe that Congress does not have the ability to entrust an agency to carry out broad mandates like we need clean air. And you scientists at the EPA will assess like what constitutes clean air, because you're scientists and you know that this chemical that I can't even pronounce, never mind even know what it is, benzoprazine, whatever you want to call it, is actually not healthy in this amount of dose. But I'm a congressperson and I don't know that. So I will delegate that authority to you. The right-wing conservative justices who sit on the Supreme Court now do not believe, well, have decided that Congress does not have that authority to delegate that authority, and they are going to bit by bit chip away at an ability for the EPA, the FDA, OSHA, SEC, FTC. I mean, every agency is going to have their ability to protect people diminished step by step by step. This is their plan. The Chevron doctrine is another one where the idea that the courts would defer to experts to make certain assessments. Slightly different concept than Congress being able to say, like, we're going to give you a broad mandate, protect workers. We'll let you how to figure it out best.
And it works in the reverse, too. I mean, a lot of the way that the conservative Supreme Court is throwing their hands up about protecting people is saying, well, this is Congress's job to legislate as well. Fully understanding, or abortion's a good example, fully understanding that Congress will never be able to do such a thing.
Of course. And frankly, like, how specific does Congress need to be? What if there needs to be a change in the vaccination because there's a change in the variant of COVID? Does Congress need to say, we authorized a vaccine for, with the Supreme Court said they authorized a vaccine for Omicron, but not for Delta? Or they authorized a vaccine for Delta, but not for Omicron. I mean, this is where they're going. And you could just see that they're just willing to make up these doctrines of like, doesn't exist inside. So, I mean, the threat exists outside. So it's not a workplace hazard.
Yeah, that's the third category here, too, is that this is a part of a deliberate attempt to undermine worker protections that we're going to be seeing as a theme of this Supreme Court.
Absolutely.